Good morning, everyone. We are here with Michael Sabet. He is a lawyer by training who practiced constitutional litigation in Ottawa after clerking at the Supreme Court of Canada. He is currently pursuing a PhD in political science at the University of Toronto, where his research examines the intersection of the Baha'i framework for governance and political philosophy. He also serves as the editor of the Journal of Bahá'í Studies. Please join me in welcoming Michael to this session. Good morning, Michael.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Could you please share how your ABS presentation relates to the theme of peace?
Yeah, so a bit about the presentation. Todd Smith and I had written an article whose basic idea was thinking about how are people viewing democracy today? And I think it's fair to say we're at a place where not just lay people, but political scientists themselves have a lot of concerns that democracy may be in crisis. And there's different contributors to that, and people are thinking about it in different ways. But what Todd and I were trying to do was to say, given the kinds of problems that we see emerging in really even established democracies, how might Baha'i perspective on these problems help possibly illuminate some of the contributors, but also then what would a Baha'i constructive contribution be to the conversation? It's obviously easy to critique, and it's maybe more useful for Baha'is to be able to think about, are there things in our own experience or in our own teachings that could help inform the discussion around democracy? And we want to do this frankly, and to say this is what we know, this is what we've learned, but also with the humility to say we don't have all the answers, and our own understanding of what a democratic system could be is evolving. So that paper informed the presentation, and in the presentation what we were hoping in a fairly large sort of audience was to engage the participants in that discussion themselves, have them think through, okay, in my life, when does this conversation come up? And for some of them it could be, depending on who they are, it could be in a fairly formal discussion. And others, it might be, you're at a bus stop, you meet someone and they say something despairing about the state of democracy in their country. What's a way to take that conversation and elevate it? Now, our paper and the talk did not directly deal with the topic of peace. So in anticipation of this conversation, it was very interesting to think through, what are those implications? And so I have a few thoughts that I can share, but I'm definitely looking forward to bouncing ideas off with you and our listeners too. If they want to read the paper, I think it'll be available, and it may spark insights as well as to the implications for peace.
And we will share the link to that paper, so those who are interested in reading it can do so. The question I have, Michael, here about democracy. There was so much hype about democracy in the aftermath of the collapse of the Berlin Wall. We called it the era of democratic peace, what the era that pursued in 1990s. But at the same time, in the new millennium, we're speaking about the fact that maybe perhaps democracy is globally on the decline. Is this what you're seeing?
Yeah, it's a great question. Such an interesting question. So you can think about, Fukuyama famously declares the end of history, that the Cold War has been won essentially by the liberal order, and there are no more viable competitors on the world scene for a system that can structure a society. So liberalism will grow and expand, and eventually the whole world will look like sort of a bunch of liberal capitalist democracies.
Sure.
It's interesting that you can find a similar optimism, if you want to see that as optimism, you can find a similar optimism in the Baha'i writings, where there's a vision that humanity has a destiny, that we're going towards a bright future. And while that isn't common, there are also some interesting nuances of difference. And one I think that strikes me is when Baha'is think about social change, we're always trying to keep in mind the idea that social change requires three protagonists. So there's institutions, there are communities, and then there are individuals. And political science focuses on institutions and sometimes brings in concepts of community. But the individual, the idea that the individual can have a role in social change, or even more radically, that the individual can change in order to affect political change, that idea is fairly marginal, I think, within political science as a whole, and has been since at least Machiavelli. So, not to get too far into the literature, but if you go back to the ancients, Plato, in talking about political theory at sort of the dawn of the Western canon, he is deeply interested in the individual. In fact, the Republic is written as a way of analogizing from how you create justice in an individual, how an individual becomes a just person. He analogizes to a city in order to explore that question. But by the time you get to Machiavelli, Machiavelli says, look, I've never seen any evidence that people will change. People are what they are. They're selfish. They can be violent. And politics needs to be about acknowledging that reality and then controlling that. And I think that maybe what we see in terms of this discourse around democratic decline is that institutional design, even robust institutional design with constitutions that protect human rights, set limits on the power of governments, by itself, if there's no discussion of who is the individual that we're cultivating within this system, and if that discussion is lacking, then there's always going to be a gravitational pull towards behaviors that are corrosive of democracy. So something we talk about is in the paper is that in an election, for instance, the incentive structure is such that the competing parties want to win. Now, they may also want to do good policy, to get elected to do good things for the country, but the system incentivizes them to win the election at all costs. And if your goal is to win at all costs, then you will be drawn towards behaviors that let you win. Lying, vilifying certain groups. And you can put in laws and regulations to try to curtail those, but the logic of the system will always make them attractive. So, this is getting a bit rambly, but that's okay. If you can bring in a conversation about who's the person who we're trying to cultivate in the system, can we imagine a world where nobody would want to do those things? Not because there are rules against it, but because that's not their understanding of their own nobility and their own place in the world. Then maybe we've put in a more robust guardrail against democratic decline.
Sure. Thank you for this. Before coming back to Fukuyama, you mentioned him. The question that would lead to that next question I have for you is or has to do with the Baha'i contribution to the debate on democracy. What is the Baha'i contribution? Does the Baha'i faith and the writings endorse democracy? Or do you think that there are conflicting tendencies here? What is your take after searching for the concept?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Shoghi Effendi, the guardian of the Baha'i faith, says that the system of governance that Baha'u'llah has created and that the Baha'is are learning to implement, it takes the sort of the best features of existing systems, including democracy, but it doesn't look purely like a democracy as we know it today. And so maybe that's a statement that can be unpacked a lot, and I wouldn't claim to sort of be able to definitively say this is the aspect in which it is democratic, and here are ways in which it exceeds the bounds of democracy. But take, for instance, the idea in our modern democracies, we would say that the role of a representative, most people would say this, not everyone, most people say the role of a representative whom I elect is to represent my views. And it's the privilege of the winning party to decide what happens in a country, but on behalf of the constituents who voted for them. Now, on the surface, that can be quite an attractive view. It seems like that is the closest we can get to direct rule by the people. If our country's too big for people to actually make all decisions themselves, then they delegate the decision-making power to an agent who will act on their behalf and do exactly what they want. Now, in the Baha'i system, that concept does not exist. On the one hand, we have far greater freedoms in our elections. So if I'm electing my local Baha'i assembly, I'm not restricted to choosing from candidates who have advanced themselves and self-selected to be on a ballot, which would restrict me to 2 to 5 choices in a typical party system. We have no parties, and nobody runs for election. So I'm free to vote for any adult in the community who I think will do a good job on that administrative body. But once I've made my vote, and once that assembly is chosen, and it will consist of people who did not, I won't say didn't want to be on the assembly, that may be the case for some of them. It, I think, can be quite an arduous responsibility. But they certainly didn't self-select. They weren't seeking power. But now that they have been chosen, they choose to serve the community. Once that choice is made, decision-making power is theirs. They are not beholden to my views, and I have no control over them in terms of, saying, I voted for you, you're responsible to me for your decision-making on the assembly. Now, they are tasked with consulting with the community, and we can get into consultation. In my estimation, that flow of information and of insight from community to institutions is actually much more robust in the Baha'i community than in mainstream democracy, because it doesn't just happen at election time. Sure. It's a continuing feature of the community. But ultimately, that assembly is beholden to the members are beholden to their own conscience in terms of how they make decisions. So you could say, is that actually democratic in the way that we expect democracy to function in the real, or in the wider world? And you could have a technical discussion about that. What technically do we mean by democracy in the modern day, which has changed a lot since the idea was sort of created in ancient Greece. But regardless of where it falls on a sort of a technical definition of democracy, it brings certain strengths to governance, I think, that may hold insight for the wider world.
Oh, that's very good. Referencing Fukuyama and his seminal work, The End of History and The Last Man, in there referencing liberal democracy, what we are witnessing, he wrote, is perhaps the end of history as such, his words. Can we speak about a Baha'i democratic system at the global level? For example, in the World Order of Baha'u'llah, Shoghi Effendi speaks about the advent of a global commonwealth system. He references it as something of a super state. That's the word he uses, super state. And there is a world parliament there, according to him. National elections will be upheld. So the system looks somewhat republican, somewhat democratic. Could you tell us about that system of global governance that the Baha'i faith promotes as constituting the future of the world order?
Oh, that's a great question. I also say it's one slightly beyond my pay grade. I think, I've read different views from Baha'is themselves about sort of what is the trajectory that we can anticipate for global governance going forward. My sense, I think the view that I resonate the most with was expressed by Roshan Danesh in his scholarship on the concept of Baha'i law generally. But he suggests that certainly the path towards a future system of global governance, we can't know in detail what it's going to look like. But it does seem clear from the guidance that we have that the path towards it will be one that all people around the world, and every people sort of individually, will have a hand in shaping, and they will choose their own paths. What I can, I think, speak maybe a bit more to is if we look at the system that Baha'is themselves use to govern themselves today, what can we learn and extrapolate from this that might hold an insight for the questions facing the global community today? I think a fundamental principle for Baha'i, if we want to call it political practice, but really anything Baha'is do, is that there has to be coherence between ends and means. Now, that is not a uniquely Baha'i idea. You find that in political philosophies, you find that in anarchism, for instance. But in the Baha'i conception, the particular end that we have in mind is very clearly defined. And that Baha'u'llah tells us that the purpose of his revelation, the primary purpose, the one that sort of overlays all other goals that it has, is to effect the unification of humankind, true oneness of humankind, which he expresses as this is an ontological reality. Now we are going to give it real social reality. So it may seem intuitive that you can't you can't work towards a goal using means that are inimical to that goal, people would say, oh, well, of course, but we see it all the time. We see people with very lofty goals who use ignoble means to try to advance them. For Baha'is, we cannot, and to our utmost strive not to, advance towards that goal of unity using divisive means. Sure. And so you see this at all levels. You see in our local communities, again, there are no factions, there are no parties, and the mode by which we make decisions, consultation, is both in its sort of formal rules designed to prevent schism and faction, but also in the culture that we cultivate around it. Yeah. It creates a deep normative commitment to fight for unity.
Sure. Could you, Michael, right here, quickly elaborate for our viewers, if there is no advertisement there, how does the candidate make himself or herself known?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah. So I guess you could think about this in two ways. You could either say there are no candidates in a Baha'i election, or you could say everyone is potentially a candidate. Yeah. Maybe what it points to is that it's just the concept of candidacy doesn't map on well to a Baha'i election. Sure. But the general sense, as I understand it, is in your local community, everyone is, so we have this idea that we're moving towards universal participation, which means in my local community, say in Calgary, I am to be fulsomely involved in the activities of the community, and through that process I get to know people. And I get to know who demonstrates certain qualities. And Shoghi Effendi, the guardian of the Baha'i faith, lays out what are some of the qualities we would look for in those we'd vote for in an assembly. They include things like a well-trained mind, but they also primarily focus on sort of virtues, spiritual qualities, honesty, loyalty. And in my understanding, once that vote happens, 9 people will be selected for local assembly. The election of 9 people is actually not a statement that other people were not also worthy of election. Uh-huh. We might aspire to a community where every single member would be a perfectly, like a wonderful member of an assembly. It's just that was the decision that was made, and now these friends are tasked with this particular responsibility of serving on the assembly. And because that sort of self-promotional motivation is just, it's not only that it's absent, it just doesn't translate in that system. I think it can be okay if somebody who's perfectly qualified doesn't get elected in a...
Well, thank you for that. Yeah. Thank you for unpacking this for us. On one level, what I'm hearing from you is that the Baha'i system is democratic, but at the same time, democracy is transcended here. It doesn't just quite replicate a pure democratic system. There are also other elements involved here, which really goes back to this phrase in the Promised Days Come that Shoghi Effendi spoke about when he talked about the 3 false gods, the chief idols in this desecrated temple of mankind, he wrote, are none others than the triple false gods of racialism, communism, and nationalism, at whose altars government and people, whether democratic or totalitarian, are now worshipping. So he's here critiquing, in a sense, democratic systems too, for the kind of representational system that they have. Given your expertise, and this constitutes my last question, given your expertise in political philosophy, I know you've done work on Immanuel Kant, and Kant has dedicated the most systematic attention among liberal scholars to unpacking this thing that he calls perpetual peace. And so does Baha'u'llah. Most great peace is about a permanent, all-inclusive global peace. So there is a lot of parallel between the two. However, when you go over Kant's physical geography, his conception of humanity becomes a bizarrely racial category. In there, Kant wrote, humanity is at its greatest perfection, and I'm quoting him. Humanity is at its greatest perfection in the race of the white. The yellow Indians have some meager talent. The Negroes are far below them. And he goes on and on. It's really bizarre. But Baha'u'llah gives us something quite emancipatory in that here the racial differences are rejected and problematized. Could you speak to the Kantian notion of peace, and perhaps where does the Baha'i faith intervene?
That's so interesting. it's a good reminder, I think, that when we read scholars, including scholars in our own time, and even, I mean, goodness knows, in a few hundred years, if people look back on work that people around us have done, I suspect they'll find that our thinking was at this place of intersection between light and dark. And I think you see this in many sort of great thinkers, but also who have problematic ideas in the past, that they have inklings of the direction in which humanity needs to go, but their thinking is still contaminated by just the pathologies that afflict our societies. And so you see this in Kant, this dichotomy in thinkers like Kant between the loftiest sentiments about the possibility of peace on a global scale, and yet still the replication of simply unfounded ideas about racial hierarchy. My sense today, so just to think about what Kant's story is about peace. So he argues that, in a nutshell, if we want to move towards a system of peace, the ideal would be for every nation state on earth to have a republican form of government. Without getting into detail for the audience, essentially what he's saying is if people are more or less responsible for their own decision making, they won't choose war, because a monarch can choose war because they're not going to be on the front lines. Their property isn't going to be destroyed by warfare, but the common people are the ones who will end up fighting, who will end up dying, and whose wealth will be dissipated for the war effort. That's an attractive story. So, and it's led to democratic peace theory, the idea that democracies generally will not go to war. But then you think about, so the Guardian talks about racialism, talks about nationalism. Oh. Maybe I would just point to, for the listeners, this fascinating passage in a tablet that Baha'u'llah writes to Queen Victoria. So he writes to many leaders of his time. And in the letter to Queen Victoria, he highlights something as praiseworthy. And he says, we hear, and this will be possibly a bad paraphrase, but he says, we hear that you have entrusted the affairs of the country to the representatives of the people. So he's basically saying, you, Great Britain at this time, have a democracy. Now, he does not say it is a perfect democracy, and it was not. But in its broad outlines, we would recognize the beginnings or a form of what we would today say is democratic. Members of local communities are voting for representatives to go to Parliament. But then he says something so fascinating. He says, when they enter their deliberations, these representatives have to have as their object the well-being of everyone on earth. And then he in the next paragraph, he goes on to say that this is basically the duty of all democratically elected representatives, is to have their object to be the well-being of humanity. So to me, when I read that, I see a democracy that is post-nationalistic, not in the sense that it's post-patriotic. And the Shoghi Effendi himself says there's nothing wrong with saying patriotism. I think it's fine, for instance, at the Olympics to cheer on your country. In the realm of sport, that can be great, a little friendly competitiveness, wonderful thing. But when it comes to decisions affecting governance, we have to recognize our oneness, and that foundational principle of the oneness of humanity that permeates everything that Baha'u'llah writes. It's often expressed in this metaphor of the human body, where if we want to understand humanity, think of all of humanity as one human body. It would be unthinkable for the hand to make a decision that goes against the interests of the leg. If we can aspire to that way of thinking, where even our local democratically elected officials say, I mean, many of their decisions may have no implications for humanity as a whole, but they always have that framework in mind that we are here to represent the well-being of all the human race in everything that we do. I think that it would so radically change, even absent any institutional reform, that norm would so radically change the nature of our democracy that it's hard to even imagine what the results could be. But if you think about peace, that is democratic peace theory, where a democracy is a system where the people recognize their oneness with everyone on earth. And so, whether a direct democracy or a representative democracy, the democracy cannot function in a way that is antagonistic towards any other people on earth.
That was very good. Thank you very much, Mike. It was a great pleasure to have you here, and thank you for your time. I really appreciate it, sir.
Thank you so much for having me. It was
Thank you.
a lot of fun.